эта семья требует трупы.
А я его не брала, твой труп.
А
я
я
его не ем. А ты сказал, что я котлеты делаю, бессовестно.
This is one of the most depraved human beings Russia ever produced. This is his mother, and this is the possible number of their total victims. But taking their lives only just wasn't good enough. This relationship reached a new level of horror, the one which will make you sick for days. And the worst part is, children were on the menu. In early June 1996 in Novokuznetsk, terrible finds were discovered on the banks of Aba River. Parts of children's bodies and skulls were recovered from the water, and just 2 days later, several more body fragments were found. According to the remains, forensic experts determined that at least 6 girls and 3 boys aged from 9 to 14 lost their lives. The operational investigation group formed from the representatives of the prosecutor's office and the criminal investigation department of the cities of Novokuznetsk and Kemerovo began working out several versions. The first assumption was made by forensic experts, and they all came to a joint conclusion. Such a thorough dismemberment of the bodies could not have been carried out on the street. The children were killed and dismembered indoors. Then the body parts were dumped in the river. The examination established that the tools of the crime were a knife and a saw, and then the reaper used them quite professionally. The child hunter most likely chose his victims from dysfunctional families. In recent years, their number has increased, especially after the Kuznetsk metallurgical plant, which gave work to many citizens, almost stopped running. According to the police, about 120 children were reported missing, and most of them ran away from the home unable to bear the abuse of their parents. Hundreds of police officers, internal troops, soldiers of the local garrisons rushed to catch the criminal. Residential areas and forest plantations were surveyed, and people with mental disabilities, people with sexual abnormalities, and dysfunctional families were questioned. However, the children kept disappearing. Just 2 weeks after the terrible finds in the Aba River, 14-year-old Lena Sakharova and 15-year-old Olia Nikitina went missing. They checked the city discos, youth cafes, bars, but the girls were nowhere to be found. The deputy chief of the criminal police of Novokuznetsk, Vladimir Semenov, who led the search, having studied the alleged routes of the movement of the criminal, came to the conclusion that the maniac has a car. The traffic police units were ordered to immediately detain all drivers with children in the passenger compartment in order to find the identity of the driver. The girls could also get into the environment of drug addicts. On the instructions of the head of the Department of Internal Affairs of Novokuznetsk, a large-scale operation was carried out in the city. Dozens of apartments, basements, warehouses where drug addicts gathered were checked, and the detainees were shown the photos of Lena and Olia, but nobody saw the girls in the circle. At this time, the newspaper printed terrible stories about this monster that takes children, and there was a panic among the parents. They accused the police of inaction and demanded to immediately find and neutralize the criminal. Since the beginning of the summer holidays, 43 teenagers have already disappeared. If we assume the worst, then it is unlikely that such a thing was possible for one person, and the members of the operational search group worked out the version. Children are hostages and kidnapped for ransom. In the city, there were several Caucasian groups, but the Caucasians detained for various offenses categorically denied any relation to kidnapping, especially the brutal killing of children. If the children were not abducted for ransom, then the worst of the options remained. And in this black business, unthinkable money was spinning. In Novokuznetsk and in the Kemerov region, all hospitals, morgues, and medical institutes were taken under secret control. The personal files of all the surgeons and pathologists were studied. At the same time, the baggage of air passengers flying to Moscow and the other major cities of Russia were examined with special care. Similar operational activities were carried out in Moscow itself, especially at the Sheremetyevo. Airport custom officials carefully examined all the items that could serve as containers for human organs, but they didn't find any evidence. Literally nothing was known about the criminal, other than that he professionally dismembered the dead. Studying the growing list of missing children, they came across a strange pattern. Most of the missing girls were named Elena and Olga, and all of the girls were between the ages 11 and 15. It was unthinkable to imagine that the criminal walked down the street, asked for names, then sat in his car and took them away. Studying the information, the detectives received the answer. Among those convicted of raping minors, there were only two people whose victims were both Elena and Olga. One now lives in the Stavropol territory, and the other one, after serving his sentence, left for Tatarstan. However, Semenov suggested once again to carefully work out the version of a maniac. In Novokuznetsk, they checked a wider range of suspects who had served time for violating minors. After a thorough analysis of the characteristics of the suspects, Semenov settled on a former driver who recently worked as a butcher at a collective farm market, named Gurkin Grigory. In the market, his name was Gocha, age 40, and by nature unsociable, irritable, stingy, and lived in a communal apartment. When they checked the accumulated information again, they suddenly found that Gurkin had already been detained during an operation. The butcher was immediately placed under covert surveillance, leaving early in the morning to go to the market, take the meat carcasses, and then start shopping. After finishing work, as a rule, he immediately returned home. But on the next morning, Gocha suddenly changed his route. He didn't go to the market, but in the opposite direction. The operatives didn't have the time to react and lost the sight of him. In the evening, Gurkin did not return home, and in the morning, neighbors called the police and reported the pools of blood, and the smell of decay was clearly felt. The operatives who arrived immediately broke down the door, and there was no one in the room. There were several bags of rotten pork on the floor and a pool of blood under them. By the evening, the owner was found. It turns out that he had an accident and he was in the hospital. And in that period, every new murder in the city, including domestic ones, was prescribed to an elusive maniac. In one of the city's vacant lots, the carefully dismembered remains of two young women were found, and both victims had the same name, Elena. But most of the detectives were struck by the fact that they were not children. 22-year-old Petrova and Savelyeva did not work anywhere. They were homeless. The ongoing serial crimes of an elusive maniac caused a sharp reaction in Moscow. The Minister of Internal Affairs demanded to detain the murderer as soon as possible. By his order, experienced employees of the main criminal investigation department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia joined the investigation, and a plan of operational search measures was developed, which provides for a total search method. Hundreds of operatives, district police officers, and public security police officers checked every street, every house, every attic and basement, and work intensified in markets, train stations, and gathering places for young people. At the same time, the operational headquarters received and analyzed any information about such crimes in the country. The intense around-the-clock work brought an unexpected result. Many of the missing children were found alive and unharmed, and all from the dysfunctional families. But the fate of 8 girls and 5 boys was still unknown. 10-year-old Sasha, 11-year-old Olia, 12-year-old Dima, 14-year-old Ira, 11-year-old Kolya Kravchenko, 13-year-old Kostya Chemich, and Pasha Volgin. They lived in the same area, studied at the same school, and all disappeared without a trace on the same day. The only witness, a classmate of one of the missing boys, saw them on the site where a residential building was being built, and the children often spent time there. The detectives examined every meter of the construction site, checked all the rooms and hidden places, interviewed all the builders, and at one point asked themselves, could it have happened that the children falling into the crevasse between concrete blocks and then they were accidentally bricked up? But as the chief engineer vouched, it was impossible. All at once, 6 children, this time from quite prosperous families, disappeared in broad daylight, and not somewhere in the backyard, wasteland, or in the woods. Although they established that cementing them alive was literally impossible, it was necessary to check this version as well. Together with the diggers, the operatives examined more than 1 kilometer of underground utilities. They checked all the drains, including the Aba River, where parts of the children's bodies were found. But there were extremely strong bars everywhere, locked with locks. Novokuznetsk Reaper literally eclipsed all known maniacs with his audacity and cruelty. He acted in broad daylight anywhere in the city. Each time his victims were several children at once, and it was a huge mystery. How the hell there was no any witnesses whatsoever? There was only one hope. The practice of investigative work showed that all serial maniacs eventually got caught. The further they went, the more they needed the bloody drug, and with each new murder, they thought less about caution. Work in the operational headquarters was in full swing around the clock, and the maniac seemed to have disappeared until one day. On July 20th, a 6-year-old girl, Polya Nikolaeva, was found strangled in a bunker. An employee of the Novokuznetsk Criminal Investigation Department was sent to Toliati to coordinate actions. A day later, and according to the testimony of witnesses, a sketch of the criminal was made. It was a man in the 30s. They had seen him with Polya near the house of the Poplar Street, where her family lived. By the evening, the name of the killer became known: Oleg Rilkov. He has been wanted for 6 months on suspicion of committing rape several times. A few days later, the name of Rilkov surfaced from a completely unexpected side. On one of the Toliatinsk markets, a police patrol detained a citizen while trying to sell a fake bill. He had no documents with him, but he confidently gave his name, Yashchenko, and with his name, his address, and 2 days later he was summoned in a police station. And it really was Yashchenko. The staff described in detail the looks of the other man. So this is my friend, Oleg Rilkov, Yashchenko replied. And then the police experienced a real shock. They literally had him in their hands, but he presented himself as his friend. Having received an unexpected gift of fate, Rilkov most likely left the city. According to Yashchenko's testimony, his friend was going to the Novokuznetsk. So the unknown Novokuznetsk Reaper was Toliati maniac Oleg Rilkov, and his sketch was posted in crowded places in Novokuznetsk. Semenov urgently found out the details of Rilkov's previous atrocities in Toliati. It was amazing that the children themselves opened the door for him when he asked for a drink of water, to call an ambulance for his grandmother or something like that. Then he violated them and robbed the apartment. Through television and newspapers, the leadership of the Department of Internal Affairs in Novokuznetsk repeatedly warned parents not to leave their children unattended. Despite the efforts of the police, 2 girls soon disappeared again. 12-year-old Galia Shadrina and Olia Vetkina, and again, no witnesses. And then, a miracle happens.
Значит, вкратце произошло вот, значит, изнасилование, развратные действия и в отношении Полины. На кровать, она упала лицом вниз, коленки были на полу. Значит, я ударил, топор у меня был в правой руке, я ударил ее по затылку обухом топора, ну, тыльной стороной топора, несколько раз, где-то 4-5 раз. Она захрипела, потом, значит, затихла. Я вышел на улицу, взял бидончик и набирал ягод.
Rilkov talked about more and more crimes. By that point, he had mastered the ways to get into the apartment without breaking in. And this time, it was easier. In house number 9 on Zelenaya Street, Rilkov was visiting the children. He immediately let him in when he asked to use the phone.
Там были игры, пытался, значит, за ней проход и изнасиловать, ну, много объяснить почему, короче говоря, не сделал. Ну, вот так, поиздевался, короче говоря. Вот. А ну до этого мальчика ударил по пару.
The boy miraculously survived and called the police. 8-year-old Natasha died 4 days later.
Как это не кощунственно звучит, но что-то такое облегчение, высшее наслаждение, чтобы так сказать. То, что вот после первого убийства, я не знаю, как это сформулировать, там, наоборот, там, ну, что-то внутреннее толкало продолжить.
Semenov went to Toliati and waited patiently for Rilkov to start telling about his bloody adventures in Novokuznetsk. During the next interrogation, a phone call from Novokuznetsk suddenly rang out. 2 days ago, 3 underage girls disappeared in the city, and this morning, the severed head of one of them was found and identified. It seems like it was far from over. Vladimir Semenov and his subordinates returned to the starting line in search of a serial killer. The investigation could only learn something new by carefully studying the circumstances of the disappearance of the 3 girls. Detectives found out that 2 days before this terrible discovery in the wasteland, 13-year-old Nastia and Zhenya and 15-year-old Olia, while being treated in the hospital, went for a walk without telling any of the adults about it. After plastic reconstruction of the skin, the head was shown to the parents of the missing girls, and one of the mothers was horrified. She recognized the features of her daughter, Nastia. Operatives checked all possible places where the girls could go from the hospital for their last walk. Semenov also instructed to check the nearest shopping stores, and intense search for the girls gets a result. In a department store on Pioneskara Street, one of the saleswomen identified the girls from the photos. They were in the store, they bought a bottle of water, and they briefly talked to her. She also remembered that an elderly woman came up to the girls and asked them for something, and then they left with her. Semenov understood that if the saleswoman was not mistaken, then the matter took a completely different turn. According to her descriptions, she was a plump woman of short stature, about 60 years old. They immediately think of human trafficking and call in a sketch artist to assist with the image of the woman in question. In the city, a special operation was immediately carried out on nightclubs, massage parlors. However, the questioned prostitutes never saw the missing girls in their circle. Operatives once again carefully worked out a residential area in the Pionerskaya Street, and the sketch was distributed to all district police officers, and one of them found in the sketch a slight resemblance to a certain person called Lyudmila Spesitsev. At that time, she lived in apartment 357 on Pionierskaya Street, and she is remembered for the fact that she was constantly in conflict with all the neighbors because of the constant floods and loud music. Spesitsev worked nearby, a kindergarten caretaker, and it turned out she has a son, Alexander, born in 1970, who was currently being treated in a psychiatric hospital in Orel. The police immediately went to Spesitseva at work, and there they reported that she left 2 days ago and abandoned the service room at the kindergarten. The operatives then decided to check the old apartment on Pionierskaya Street, but she was not there either. Since Spesitseva was still registered in this apartment, the district police officer was instructed to periodically visit there. Only a day later, the plumbers of the local house of self-government complained. They have prevention of the heating system before the winter period, and the woman from apartment 357 just doesn't let them in. By some informations, they doubted that her son, who is mentally ill, has been kept there against his will. Semenov understood everything and immediately gave instructions to urgently contact the city of Orel and find out whether the young Spesitsev is currently undergoing psychiatric treatment. And 1 hour later, Semenov received a stunning response. The patient Alexander Spesitsev has been discharged from the clinic 2 years ago. At that time, neighbors had enough and complained about the horrific smell that comes from the apartment, and one of the district officers went to the scene trying to break in after many failed attempts to peacefully go through the door. Despite the persuasions and threats, the voice behind the door continued to repeat that he was locked, and he couldn't see the district police officer's certificate through the peephole. However, upon learning the news from psychiatric establishment, Semenov immediately tried to get into contact with the people outside of the apartment and warned them not to go inside without any backup, but it was too late. They broke the door, and what they saw inside will haunt them forever. Once inside, they witness a nightmare. The half-dead naked girl who appears to be stabbed in the stomach. She was very weak, starved, disoriented, with a broken arm, and on the brink of death. And when the officer went into bathroom, his legs gave away. He hadn't seen this even in horror movies. The girl was immediately taken to the hospital, where it was discovered that it was a 15-year-old Olia who disappeared a month ago with the 2 friends, Nastya and Zhenya. In a hospital bed, she gave her first testimony.
Оля, скажи, пожалуйста, кто привел вас в квартиру? Бабушка? При каких обстоятельствах? Как она вас привела? Дверь не может открыть? Она не может, да? И поэтому позвала вас, чтобы помогли.
The next day, Lyudmila Spesitseva was detained. Meanwhile, the police were looking for her son, Alexander. At the very last moment, he managed to escape through the roof of the building. And after only 3 days, he was detained near the building's entrance, as he was wandering around hungry, searching for food.
Я увлекаюсь не только музыкой, я увлекаюсь и музыкой, и рисованием, и техникой, в смысле.
Вы рисуете, да?
Ну да, когда желание есть. Могу стихи писать, но стихи я не считаю, что это что-то целое. Потому что...
Писали стихи?
Пробовал. Я любил просто даже сесть на лавочку и просто смотреть, как шелестит вокруг деревья. Ну, если их не вырубили, конечно.
But it wasn't just rustling of the leaves that Spesitsev told during the interrogations. How this person committed such a monstrous act, and how it came to it in the first place. In 1991, he met a girl, Zhenya Guselnikova, and they dated together. Alexander soon turned violent, and after she decided to break up with him, he locked her in the apartment and then tortured her for a whole month. According to the official version, she died of exhaustion and sepsis, and instead of going to prison, they soon established that a failed Grom needs psychiatric treatment. Spesitsev was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was sent to Orel for treatment. 3 years later, the medical commission recognized Spesitsev as a recovered person. He went back to his apartment, and the music started playing even louder. He began to take revenge for all the insults he endured in the mental hospital. The only meaning of his life was hate. He was also very troubled by the fact that he was basically impotent, and the story behind his condition was as twisted as everything else. While in the mental establishment, he wanted to prove his libido. So because of his idea, one other patient sewed a metal pellet inside his thing. As a result, Spesitsev ended up with a nasty inflammation and infection.
Глаза об этой болезни говорит или вдруг напоминает на эту тему. Я просто его ненавижу. Я просто ненавижу таких людей.
However, Alexander didn't hate all of them. He often went to the train station, talked to the homeless beggars and the local junks, and sometimes treated them to cheap port wine, and actually found them to be great listeners. And there, at the same train station, Spesitsev met Elena Trunova and invited her home, but she never left his apartment.
Между нами произошел половой акт в конечном итоге. Так, в разговоре появилось что-то резкое у нее, она меня апатирует. Я не выдержал. Взял нож и нанес ножевое ранение в область груди.
A month later, another 22-year-old girl, also Elena, paid with her life after accepting Spesitsev's invitation. The neighbors were horrified to hear terrible screams of the musical roar, but ultimately thought, what can you do with a mentally ill person? Having failed with women, Alexander began to hunt children. The first batch didn't take long to find, as he saw children playing at a construction site, and Spesitsev was happy to give a full picture of how that played out. After getting acquainted, I offered them to rob the apartment. We went upstairs and I opened the door and invited them to go to my bedroom. They were worried and they suspected something was wrong. One of them started shouting. I then began to cut them roughly in the chest, struck one blow at a time. After I was done, I moved them all to one place in the bedroom near the wardrobe and covered the bodies with a rag, and I just left them there for the next 4 days. About 1 week later, my mother, Lyudmila Spesitseva, came. I asked her to take the remains and went to the bedroom to sleep. And so it was. A loving mother carried the children's remains in buckets to the Aba River and dumped them in the water. And it was only the beginning of this twisted and sickening relationship. At night, when the last lights went out, she would quietly slip out with heavy buckets, and no one would guess the terrible secret of apartment 357.
Куски расчлененного тела уносили на улицу?
Да, они носили за кого?
Кто?
Бабулька.
Бабулька?
According to the documents, Spesitsev continued to undergo treatment in a psychiatric hospital, but in fact, he returned home a long time ago. This little bureaucratic mistake took at least 20 human lives, and in this last crime, the sadist surpassed himself. By this time, the monster had barely left its lair. On September 24th, along with the food, Lyudmila brought her son, 3 girls, to execute. In recent months, Sasha needed human blood more than food. That day, the girls ran away from the hospital to a disco. Before that, they went to the store for water, where they met an old woman who asked them to help open the door of her apartment. Spesitseva led the girls, with her knowing that they would never see a disco again. During the interrogations, she didn't deny anything. At first, she told them how they reached the 9th floor in the elevator, how the door suddenly opened and her frail son appeared. Even then, the girl accepted the invitation to enter. Everything seemed like a little adventure to them. But everything that happened next would result in the worst day of their lives. The first victim was Nastya. And in a sense, she was even lucky because she didn't have the chance to experience what Olya and Zheny experienced.
Я нанес несколько ударов.
Куда именно?
В области сердца. Ниже, чуть-чуть, где-то около желудка, в горло. Она продолжала жить, я на веревке удавил ее.
Then the sick bastard forced the girls to butcher the corpse of their friend. The captives refused, so he stabbed them with a knife. He then handcuffed the girls to the radiator and went to bed. His mother came later and, as always, took out the remains.
Она снова пришла, мать. Оказалось, что там в кастрюле еще оставалась часть мяса с Настей, которую она, видать, не вынесла за ночь. Она это сварила и сказала, чтобы я отдал девчонкам. Я отнес в спальню девчонкам это мясо.
And by some informations, both mother and son regularly indulged in eating the meat from the deceased victims. One day Spesitsev heard the girls were arranging to escape.
Получилось, что после этого я обозлился и стал избивать Женю, в результате чего она скончалась.
Что-то вы сделали с телом или нет?
Да, его разрезали на куски.
Кто?
Мать.
Ты говорила о том, что это он ей давал куски тела Насти, и она их бросала в суп.
Это она их бросала. Она так отдельно варила.
Она отдельно варила.
Потому она
Для кого?
для нас. Суп на Лену.
Ну, варила это бабушка, да?
Да,
Варила это бабушка.
для вас.
This was the last thing Olya had time to tell. The next day, this girl died. And the question remained the same. Why an ordinary apartment became a bloody torture chamber for 20 people? And was it only 20? Gold rings, chains, and other jewelry were found in the apartment of Spesitsev and counted more than 40. When they counted the deposits of blood-stained clothing, it turned out to be 82 sets, indicating that their total body count could be more than 80. Absolutely horrific. The history of the apartment 357 began 25 years ago. Since 1975, in a new building, as a rule, neighbors tried to get acquainted as quickly as possible. But from the very first days, Spesitsev seemed to be fenced off from everyone else by invisible wall. They didn't say hello, didn't make any contacts. Lyudmila believed that she had a very unlucky life, and her only joy was the youngest, Alexander. The boy was born with a weight deficit, barely survived, and often got sick, and until the age of 12, he slept in her bed. At school, the insociable Alexander had no friends. He was constantly bullied by his peers, and he dreamed of someday taking cruel revenge on everyone. His mother hated them too. These beautiful, healthy, strong children, unlike her son. When Lyudmila, who worked as a school caretaker, was kicked out for stealing sanitary equipment, she got a job in court as an assistant lawyer. She liked to bring home criminal records, mostly photographs of victims and dismembered bodies, and she spent a lot of time looking at them with her son. Moreover, he felt a strange excitement looking at these photos, and the mother, seeing the bright eyes of her son, understood how good he was at this moment, and didn't notice how her son turned from a quiet child into an animal. Life didn't turn into a nightmare for her, even when Alexander tore up 8 children in the apartment. Instead, she humbly mastered her role as a crime trace liquidator, carrying out butchered corpses at night. Very soon, she began to enjoy it and she got more involved. Wanting to please her son, she began to bring the next victims to the apartment. Ludmila realized that if her son didn't kill anyone today or tomorrow, he would feel bad, and in the end, he could kill and dismember her instead. She accepted the bestial loss of her child, unaware of the horrors of what she was doing. The mother of Novokuznetsk monster, although denying all the involvement, was found guilty for 3 murders and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And the Siberian Reaper, Alexander Spesitsev, was again declared insane and sent for compulsory treatment until the next recovery.